But we are in a two-part series on generosity. And so last week, Pastor Jason discussed the story from Joshua chapter 7 with the sin of Achan and how there were consequences for him taking that which belonged to God. And then we moved into the book of the prophet Malachi to share about the promised blessings that came along with Israel testing God through their tithes. We talked about how tithing and generosity, they are not salvation issues, right? They are matters of stewardship. And so this week, we're actually going to stay in the Old Testament as we continue to look at what it means for us to be generous. Throughout the books of the law, those being the first 5 books of the Bible, we see the concept of a tithe come up repeatedly. It was 2 purposes in the nation of Israel. The first is that it was offering to God what was his, and it was a reminder of his provision. The second is that it actually served as funding and provision for the Levites and the priests because their job was to tend to the temple and the temple alone. Beyond the laws about tithing to God, there are a number of laws that we find that are instructions to the Israelites about the generous and benevolent way that they are supposed to live. God is holy, his chosen people were to be holy and set apart. And so this generous living that's baked into the law was one of many ways that they would set themselves apart from the nations around them. So we'll take a look at a few of these laws together this morning, all in the book of Deuteronomy. We'll be jumping all over the place, so I won't give you a specific page number, but they'll be on the screen behind me. Chapter 15, verses 7 through 11. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving to you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought that the 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. And then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Chapter 22, if you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you or you do not know who owns it, take it home with you and keep it until they come looking for it, then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything they have lost. Do not ignore it. If you see your fellow Israelites' donkey or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help the owner get it to its feet. We actually find a similar law in Exodus chapter 23, and it's applied specifically to your neighbors who you hate. If you find your enemy or someone you hate with their animal stranded, help them. Deuteronomy chapter 23. If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain. And lastly, chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that's why I command you to do this. So these are just a few examples in the Old Testament law that the Israelites were to abide by. And all of these were in addition to their laws on tithes and offerings and sacrifices. Israel's obedience to the law always came with promised blessings, and disobedience came with promised curses. Several of the Old Testament prophets, when you read them, they harshly rebuke Israel for their unwillingness to be generous and do justice to the poor. Now, quick reminder on the Old Testament is that we are not bound by this law for salvation, right? We don't have to follow the law to the letter to be saved. That has been fulfilled in Christ. What we do is we hold the law up like a mirror to ourselves so that we have an accurate picture of how we measure up, or maybe rather how we fail to measure up. Then we turn to Christ to make us clean, and we abide in the spirit of the law. And obeying the law to the letter so that we can have salvation would be like hopping in the shower to try and clean yourself with the mirror. It's not going to work. We're looking at the law today to see the pattern and the standard that was established for the holy people of God. And so part of their standard of holy living and their lifestyle was to be benevolent and generous. And these laws existed to build charity among the people of God, and they all fall under what Jesus labels as the greatest commandments. He's approached by a teacher of the law in Mark 12, and he asks him, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus answers him with, the most important one is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Now, both passages that Jesus quotes, he's not making this up on the spot. He's pulling it from the law. They're pulled from the first one being Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, and the second one is Leviticus 19:18. Generosity is one of the many ways that we both love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and it's how we love our neighbor as ourselves, right? We don't have to really, to get what Jesus meant, we actually don't have to speculate. We don't have to guess. Oh, I think loving my neighbor looks like this. We actually just get to go back to the Old Testament to find our answers and our explanations and our wisdom. And every single one of these laws was an act of generosity that went beyond Israel giving their tithes. Right, to leave portions of their fields for the poor to glean from, not harvest their trees or vines a second time, leave dropped harvests behind, meant that there was always a provision for the poor and needy in their land. Right, and giving generously to the poor and taking time to help the animals of a neighbor in need, even one that you hated, was to provide for people in need and show love for both God and man by way of our actions. And all of these actions were, again, not fulfilled by the tithe. They were in addition to it. The tithe was their offering to God and provision for the Levites and priests. Their generosity was performed on top of the tithe. Tithing was their act of obligation. Generosity was the way that they were to live. Both were done in obedience to God, remembering that He is the provider of all. Because both were rooted in the same truth, that they inherited everything that they have from God. They did not deserve it. And they were to provide for others in the same way that God provided for them. And when it comes to generosity, we as Christians should remember a similar truth about ourselves, that we get to inherit a kingdom we didn't earn, we receive salvation that we didn't deserve, and we are to show love to others in the same way that God has first shown love to us. And so here's the thing that we need to understand about tithing and generosity simply is that it requires good stewardship. Generosity means that our money doesn't control us. It means we control our money for the glory of God. And my wife and I, we do our best to lead generous lives, right? We give our tithes, we go above and beyond that. We support kingdom builders in the community center. There was a while where we sponsored a child overseas. We've bought lunch for friends and family, not because they needed us to, just because we like them, though sometimes they've needed us to. We've opened our homes to be hospitable, whether it's hosting a life group or doing something like foster care. My parents actually modeled that way of living for me. They are givers through and through. Growing up, there were times where we would let needy friends and family just come and stay in our home because they needed a place. And I don't share any of this to brag. It's actually mildly uncomfortable for me to do that. I actually share it to tell you that I do my best. My wife and I do our best to practice what I'm preaching here this morning. Right? And we've also been the recipients of generosity, both big and small, throughout our lives, including from people here at New Life. And in my family, it's actually often a race to see who gets to be the one to buy lunch for everybody else, which is a race that my mother usually wins, by the way. But if you are somebody who has been generous or somebody who is generous, whether it's to us or whether it's to somebody else, let me just say simply, thank you. Right? We truly are a generous church, both as an organization and as a community of believers. And so if you have shown generosity to me and my family, any of the other pastors' families, or each other, or people outside of here, if you haven't received the thank you, I'll just do it here right now on behalf of everybody that you may have been generous to. Thank you. Because it transforms people's lives whether we recognize it or not, and it changes people's hearts whether we recognize it or not. And as just kind of a brief little side note, in my experience, receiving generosity sometimes is harder than actually being generous, because it takes just a big, huge act of humility to say, okay, thank you, I will take that. Another quick note as we talk about this is that when we talk about generosity, we should do it without any expectation of return. Now, I believe that God blesses generous people. I will hold firm to that conviction. But if I'm giving in order to get something, and that's my primary motivation, that's not generosity. That's a purchase. That's just buying something. We give because it's what God commands and it's good, and then out of doing what's good, God pours out blessing on his people. Make sense? Right on. Now, in order for the Israelites to be able to follow the generosity laws, they needed to have margin. They needed space and availability in their resources to be able to keep up with the law. This meant they couldn't be reckless in harvesting because they wouldn't, leave too much. They'd leave too much behind, and they wouldn't have enough for their own needs, right? It also meant they couldn't be too stingy because they'd leave nothing behind for the people who need it. They were instructed to live so open-handedly that a wandering traveler could just pick through their crops and have a snack. Wild. Now, to be able to give freely to the poor, to be open-handed with their fellow Israelites, and anyone who wanders in their lands, they needed to make sure they had enough to give something. And the same's true for us, right? If we want to be a people who show the love of God through generosity, we need to make sure that we have margin, because that's what generosity requires. Now, what do I mean by margin? Think of a Word document, right? It means a space, barrier, wiggle room. If you're printing something out from your computer and your margins are set too wide, your document doesn't fit. If your margins are set too small, your document's going to be really teeny tiny. You can think of it another way. I'm working on scaling back how much time I spend on my phone. And so one of the things I've done is I've limited Instagram, which is my only social media app that I'm really on, to 30 minutes a day. And so what that means is when that 30 minutes is up, my app is gone, it's locked out, I can't access it again. It's done. And so I've carefully curated my feed to be stuff that I want to see, content I want to engage with, but despite that, there's still just a bunch of stuff out there that I waste my time on. And the benefit I'm seeing with limiting my time is that when I start to get caught in time-wasting content, I see my timer go down. And I think, great, I just wasted a bunch of time that I'm not getting back watching this stupid video. The beauty of it is that, the sad part is I don't get that time back to engage with the content I want to. And so in order to get what I want, this is the beauty, I'm forced to create space and intentionality while browsing social media so that I get the most out of it. In modern America, for all of our wealth and prosperity, we don't really live with this idea of margin, right? Because unlike the ancient world, we function in what we call a debt economy. We're all about buying what we can't afford, and sometimes it's just our only choice. Sometimes if you have bought a house or a car, you know what I'm talking about. But back then, in ancient Israel, if you couldn't afford something, to go into debt risked either prison or indentured servitude, aka slavery, right? Nowadays, we just have a little 3-digit score that tells lenders how good we are at being in debt so they can give us more debt. Wild, right? That's a little crazy when you think about it. But here's the thing, is that our money, put simply, controls us, right? And you don't have to be wealthy to live with margin, though as a side note, compared to many parts of the world, we are extremely wealthy, right? I have a house for my cars. Let's just be real here. I have multiple cars. That's wealth. But we don't have to be exorbitantly wealthy, even by American standards, to live with margin. We just have to be wise with what God has given us. And if that means we're only able to be generous with a little, good. If it means we can be generous with a lot, good. Because generosity isn't defined by size. Sometimes an act of generosity is actually great because of how little we have. Right? Because it's one thing if I can stand here and say, take and eat, it's a feast, I have plenty, it's not going to hurt me none. And it's another thing entirely to come before someone and say, all I have is this bread and I will share it with you. Generosity isn't about portions, it's about heart. And a generous heart cultivates margin. And so how do we get there? We get there through wise stewardship. Just to give a few examples of how we can work with what God has given us, some of us, we might just need to actually sit down and create a budget, right? So we can track what goes in and what goes out. There's apps you can download, services you can be a part of that will actually look at your spending and tell you where you might just be throwing away money. Maybe for some of us, it means we have to figure out how to live within our means, right? We all probably need cars or transportation to get around the UP because everything's super spread out. But that doesn't mean I need to go and finance a 2025 Range Rover. It also means I don't keep a money pit of a dumpster fire of a car just because it was cheap, right? I'm throwing money away. It means we can do things like evaluate our insurance rates, right? We don't want to overspend. We also don't want to be underinsured. If the time is right and the economy's good, refinance a loan or two, right? Get a better interest rate, get some lower monthly payments. We can still use this debt economy of ours to our benefit. Or maybe you get a second job or a side hustle for a season, or you do the inverse. You make the decision to work less so that you can open your schedule more and free up your home more, right? Some of you might be in a position to make investments, to build room for more generosity down the line. And if you have any tips and tricks, let me know. But for others, maybe you just cut back on a luxury or two here and there so you have room to bless others. I'll say this, I don't know what everyone's situation is, right? These ideas don't cover everything. They're a jumping off point to get the gears turning on ways that we can, approach our finances and whatnot so that we can be a blessing to others, right? Because generosity means that our money doesn't control us. We control our money for the glory of God. And I get it. Trust me on this. Bad things happen, right? I understand. Every one of us hits hard times, right? We get that increase in rent. We lose that job. We get that unexpected medical bill or that home repair. It feels like some of us, no matter how hard we try or how diligent we are, we're giving it our best and we just can't keep money in our accounts no matter how hard we try. I hear you. I've been there. And those things might change how we express our generosity in seasons, but they shouldn't negate it, right? Because even the Levites who lived off of the giving and the provisions of others were still required to also tithe. And my wife and I, we've had to reevaluate how we express generosity from time to time, right? But we've never outright stopped being generous. And in fact, wise stewardship of what we have, it's often critical in getting us out of some hard seasons into more prosperous seasons, whatever that looks like for you. Good stewardship and planning often seems to be the lifeboat that gets us back to shore, so to speak. And again, hear what I'm saying on this, don't hear what I'm not. I'm not asking you to light yourself on fire to keep somebody else warm. But what we should do is do our best to keep our fires going, however big that fire may be, so that we can bless other people with its warmth. Right? Our hearts as Christians should always be geared at looking at how we can give and how we can share whatever is right for us, whatever God leads us to do. Because God has given us our money to use for His glory. That includes both how we give. It also just includes how we manage it within our homes. Charismatic pastor David Campbell, he puts it this way. He says that the fact is that our use of money is about the most reliable external indicator of where our heart is. And I got that from the man who said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It was Jesus. That passage can be found in Matthew 6:21. The fact is that our use of money is about the most reliable external indicator of where our heart is. And I'll just be real, for some of us in this room, the reason we hate hearing messages on giving is because money's still an idol for us. And so what needs to happen is that idol of money needs to be broken so that God can do what He wants to do for us. But we steward what we have wisely so that we can live with open hands and open hearts. Even the laws about helping neighbors with wandering or fallen animals required a degree of margin, right? It didn't need it in finances, it needed it in time. Though business people love to often say that time is money, right? To help a neighbor in need meant that Israelites had to give their time, and giving their time might have meant something else didn't get done. But a life with wisely stewarded margin has space for generous time, and a life without it doesn't. Because another problem of our modern world, you might live it, you might just see it, it's this hustle and grind mindset, right? We got to be doing. We got to be moving somewhere and doing it with purpose, right? We can hardly ever just be, myself included. But what that means is that we don't end up fully living a life with margin. God gave us money. He also gave us our time. And what good is it if I have all of the finances in the world to be generous, but I don't have the time to make use of it, right? We don't need to abandon our schedules, but we do need space here and there to be interrupted. Because generosity also means that our time doesn't control us, but we control our time for the glory of God. And for an ancient Israelite, perhaps they fell behind for the day in their harvest. They didn't get as much seeds in the ground as they wanted. Helping someone may have meant they would need to do more work to catch up, or they just have to do a different approach for the day. It might have even meant that by being open-handed, somebody got something that they didn't outright deserve. But they were still supposed to do it anyway. They were still supposed to be generous anyway because they didn't deserve the provisions God had given them in the first place. And so some of us, we might not be able to be generous with finances, but we can be generous with time. Ideally, I'd like to be able to be generous with both. That'd be fantastic. But our goal as believers should be to always give to God what belongs to him. That's our tithe. And then we live as the Israelites were instructed to, with a heart that is generous and geared toward loving our neighbors as ourselves. And we have plenty of ways for you to be generous here, right? By giving above and beyond to kingdom builders. That's how we support missionaries. That's how we support the work of the kingdom of God beyond just our four walls. And in fact, if you are someone who is faithful in tithing but not giving to kingdom builders, I'd encourage you to start. Just take a leap, trust God with a little bit more, and see what happens as a result. As part of the local church, we know that we give our tithe to support the needs of the church and its ministry. And we should look to give above and beyond, not because generosity is this grudging obligation we've been guilted into, but it's something we should crave, right? We should get excited to give. It's actually why we'll share stories from missionaries, or we will line up our students here on the platform and talk about the amazing things that happened at camp or convention, because you get to hear what God is doing overseas. You get to hear what he's doing in the lives of our students or our people, and you get to think, wow, God used me to make that happen. And all I did was give. I gave some money to a guy, and then he sent students to camp, and their life was transformed forever by the gospel? Sweet deal. That's awesome. Right? We built, hang on, I'm just going to revisit this. This isn't in my notes, but we built a bathroom in Thailand for $2,000, right? You can't even begin to install plumbing in your bathroom for $2,000 in America. That's incredible, and that was just done through giving. It's amazing. We should look at the world around us and think, how can I help? What can I do? Right? Giving $5 to support someone in need doesn't feel like we're giving a lot. But when hundreds of people give what they feel like isn't a lot, it changes everything for someone. It's not about whether or not our giving is going to make or break a goal. It's about our finances being submitted to God, our hearts being wired for obedience, and then having the internal desire to just bless others however we can. Right? Like the Bible says, God loves a joyful giver. If giving is something that you dread, if it's something that you hate, then get your heart into a place where giving is a joy first. God desires the obedience over the sacrifice. And so if the sacrifice is an issue, wire the heart for obedience first. And the good news is, I love this, is that Christians, we actually lead the charge when it comes to charitable giving. Right? Statistically, we actually give more than just about everybody else. And this is how it's supposed to be. Actually, I've found this information that the Catholic Church, with counting all of their churches, their hospitals, their social services, their aid programs, the various nonprofits, they're actually considered the largest nonprofit organization on the planet with everything that they do. And that's beautiful. And the church as a whole is one of the largest nonprofits all over the country and all over the world. And this is how it's supposed to be, right? Because the world should notice the charity and the love and the giving of Christians. And then we use that as a starting point to share the gospel, right? Government doesn't lead the way. It's not about me paying more taxes so that someone else can be helped. That's not generosity. That's just paying more taxes. Secular culture doesn't lead the way in terms of charitable giving. The church is the one who leads the way, and this is the way it's supposed to be. We love because God is love. We serve because the Son of Man came not to be served, but give his life as a ransom for many. And we give because God is a giver. He has given us everything that we have, and he went so far as to give his life in our place so that we can be with him forever. Right? And so being generous, it means that our money doesn't control us. We control our money for the glory of God. If you guys would all join me in standing this morning. There's some thoughts and reflections as we close. You'll find in your bulletins we do have more of the Tithe Challenge cards. If you lost some, they are also out in our lobby or connections area. And I would encourage you, we've seen a large number of people reaffirm their commitment to tithing. We've seen other people step in faith and tithe for the first time. And for those of you who have, we're both proud of you and grateful for you for taking that next step in your faith. And I just want to encourage the rest of you, again, to commit to tithing. For, if you've never tithed before, commit to tithing for just these 60 days. Give that 10%. Take that leap of faith. See what God will do. because I can testify strongly to how I've seen the fruitfulness of tithing in my own life, not even just in terms of physical blessing, but in just the spiritual blessing that comes from it. And we believe so strongly in that here as a church that we will set it aside. And if you aren't seeing the promises of God in your life, if you aren't seeing this transformation coming from God as a result of it, then we'll hand it back to you. But I would encourage you, prayerfully look at how you can give. Look at the world around you. Look at the people in our community. Look at the people outside of our church community, and just have that heart wired for, man, how can I give? What can I do, even if all I can do is giving someone an encouraging word, taking some time out of my day to let someone know how valuable and important they are? That's still also an act of generosity with our time.